The metallic sound of the auctioneer's hammer echoed through the makeshift shed like a death sentence. Frank Williams, a 68-year-old man with grey hair and weathered blue eyes, watched helplessly as his 1929 Duesenberg Model J, one of only 481 ever made, was sold for a mere $45,000, a fraction of its real value of over $1 million. "Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt," announced Barbara Thompson, president of the HOA of Oak Ridge Heights, an exclusive suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut. Her satisfied smile contrasted with the devastated expression of Frank, who remained seated in his wheelchair, his hands trembling on the supports. "This is illegal!" protested Alexandra Martinez, Frank's lawyer, standing up abruptly. "Mr. Williams's property isn't even under the jurisdiction of the HOA. You have no authority to—" "The board's decision was unanimous," Barbara interrupted, straightening her impeccable red blazer. "The vehicles constitute visual pollution and violate the community's aesthetic guidelines. Section 8, Paragraph 3 of our bylaws." Frank closed his eyes, remembering the day he bought his first automotive rarity, a 1923 Ford Model T that he restored with his own hands. Over the course of 4 decades, his collection has grown to 25 historic vehicles, each meticulously maintained in climate-controlled garages built on his 2-acre estate. "My father has dedicated his life to preserving these pieces of American history," said Michael Williams, Frank's son, a 35-year-old university professor. "These cars are not just vehicles, they are works of art, part of this country's cultural heritage." Barbara dismissed the argument with a dismissive gesture. "Cultural heritage doesn't pay our bills or keep property values high. Oak Ridge Heights has standards to maintain." The crowd in the shed was small, only selected buyers, personally invited by Barbara. Alexandra noticed how several of them seemed to know her intimately, exchanging complicit glances as they snapped up rare vehicles for absurdly low prices. "It won't stay that way," Alexandra promised, her voice firm as she made notes on her tablet. "I'm going to file a restraining order later today." "Do as you please, dear," Barbara replied, her tone condescending. "But the vehicles have already been sold. What about the new owners? All bona fide buyers." Frank watched silently as his 1932 Packard 12 was auctioned off. The car, which he used to take terminally ill children on special outings through his Wheels of Hope Foundation, went for $38, $38, less than 5% of its market value. "You don't understand what you're destroying," said Frank, finally finding his voice. "These cars aren't just mine, they're the community's. How many charity parties, how many fundraisers?" "Mr. Williams," Barbara cut in, "your philanthropic activities, while admirable, do not justify devaluing the surrounding properties. Oak Ridge Heights is an elite community, not an open-air museum." Michael placed a comforting hand on his father's shoulder, while Alexandra made frantic calls to colleagues at the law firm. The auction continued, relentless, each strike of the hammer taking away another piece of Frank's carefully preserved history. "We need the previous property records," Alexandra whispered to Michael. "Your family bought the house before the HOA was formed, right?" "Yes. My grandfather built the property in 1952, confirmed Michael. "The HOA was only established in 1985, and we have documents proving that our property was explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction." Barbara, who had apparently overheard the conversation, just smiled. "Documents can get lost, can't they? And what about that old automatic annexation clause?" Alexandra narrowed her eyes. "What clause?" "Oh, look, the 1928 Pierce arrow is close," Barbara quipped, turning her attention back to the auction. Frank watched each car leave, taking with it memories of decades of dedication. The 1930 Cadillac Vice 16 he restored with his father before he passed away. The Rolls-Royce Phantom he used for hundreds of charity weddings for families who couldn't afford a luxury car. Each vehicle carried not only monetary value, but a piece of the history of his family and community. "This isn't just about cars," Frank murmured to Michael. "It's about power. Barbara always wanted total control over Oak Ridge Heights. My independent ownership was an affront to her authority. Alexandra continued to document everything, discreetly photographing the buyers and writing down details of the transactions. "We're going to reverse this, Mr. Williams. The way this auction was conducted, the lack of proper notice, the clearly manipulated prices, everything points to a coordinated operation." As the last car was auctioned off, a majestic 1935 Auburn Speedster, Barbara Thompson seemed to radiate satisfaction. Her plan had worked perfectly. In just 2 hours, she had not only removed what she considered a stain on her perfect community, but also secured valuable favors with strategic buyers. "The session is closed," she announced, banging the gavel one last time. "Buyers have 24 hours to remove their purchases from the property." Frank Williams remained seated in his wheelchair long after the shed had emptied, staring at the empty spaces where his beloved cars used to stand. Michael and Alexandra remained by his side, already planning the next legal steps. "We'll get them back, Dad," promised Michael. "Every single one of them." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon through the open shed door. "You know, son, it's not just the cars. It's what they represent. Decades of history, memories, moments that helped build this community. Barbara may have taken the vehicles, but she can't erase what they mean." Alexandra closed her tablet, determination in her gaze. "And that's exactly what we're going to fight for. This isn't just about property. It's about justice. About stopping people like Barbara Thompson from abusing power to destroy what others have built with love and dedication." The sun was beginning to set over Oak Ridge Heights, casting long shadows through the shed's windows. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of old engines could be heard. Buyers were already beginning to remove their ill-gotten trophies. But for Frank, Michael, and Alexandra, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the first chapter in a battle that promised to shake up the long-established power structures in their community. Alexandra Martinez flipped through the yellowed pages of the Greenwich Municipal Records as the morning light seeped through the dusty windows of the public archive. 3 days had passed since the infamous auction, and every document she examined only confirmed her suspicions. Something far more sinister was at play. "Look at this," she said to Michael Williams, who was typing furiously on his nearby laptop. In 1985, when the HOA was established, there were a number of suspicious property transfers. The company that registered the association, Meridian Holdings, belonged to Barbara Thompson's late husband. Michael adjusted his glasses, leaning over to examine the document. "And what does that mean?" "It means that Barbara knew exactly what she was doing when she claimed that automatic attachment clause. She was blatantly lying about our property being under HOA jurisdiction." Alexandra's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from her contact at the Department of Motor Vehicles. "I got it," she whispered, her eyes quickly scanning the screen. 3 of the cars have already been registered to new owners, all in Delaware, under different LLCs. "Delaware?" questioned Michael. "The corporate tax haven?" "Exactly. And guess who's the registrar for these companies? Marcus Thompson Jr., Barbara's son." Meanwhile, at the Williams home, Frank was sitting on his balcony, looking at the empty spaces where their air-conditioned garages used to house their collection. A pile of letters of support from the community was piling up on his side table. Families whose weddings he had brightened with his classic cars, sick children he had taken for memorable rides. "Mr. Williams?" A familiar voice snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Rachel Chen, a young reporter from the Greenwich Times. "Can I have a moment?" Frank gestured for her to sit down. Rachel had covered several charity events organized by him over the years. "I've been investigating some inconsistencies in the HOA's financial records," she said, opening her notebook. "In the last 6 months, there have been a number of suspicious transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands." Frank's face twitched with interest. "Go on." "The HOA increased maintenance fees by 300% for several elderly residents, forcing some to sell their homes. Interestingly, all of these properties were purchased by a single company, Oak Ridge Development Corp. Let me guess, interrupted Frank. Related to Barbara Thompson? Rachel nodded. Her daughter is the CEO. But here's the most interesting part. They're planning a new luxury development, and your property, Mr. Williams, is exactly in the center of the projected area. At that very moment, at the HOA's headquarters, Barbara Thompson was conducting an emergency board meeting. The mahogany walls and leather chairs couldn't mask the tension in the air. The Williams have hired private investigators, she informed the group. We need to act quickly. Richard, did you take care of the documents we talked about? Richard Norton, a burly man with gray hair, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Barbara, perhaps we should reconsider, if this comes to light. If it comes to light, Barbara cut in, we'll all go down. Or have you forgotten the commissions you received on the last forced sales? Back in the public archive, Alexandra discovered something that made her heart race. Michael, look at this. In 1952, when your grandfather built the property, he established a special clause. The land could only be used for residential or philanthropic purposes for 75 years. Which means that any attempt at commercial development before 2027 would be illegal. Barbara isn't just trying to steal your father's cars, she's trying to demolish a legal obstacle to her real estate project. Michael picked up his phone. I'll call Dad. He needs to know about this. But before he could dial, a breaking news notification appeared on his cell phone. Suspicious fire destroys historic garages on Williams' estate. Alexandra and Michael ran to the car, crossing the tree-lined streets of Greenwich towards the estate. When they arrived, they found Frank in his wheelchair, watching helplessly as firefighters battled the flames, consuming the structures where his beloved cars used to rest. Barbara Thompson was there too, feigning concern as she spoke to a local reporter. It's a terrible tragedy. Fortunately, the vehicles had already been removed. It just proves that our concerns about safety were valid. You hypocrite, shouted Michael, advancing towards her. Alexandra grabbed him by the arm. Not yet, she whispered. We have something much bigger here. This isn't just about the cars now. It's about a criminal conspiracy to defraud landlords and circumvent zoning laws. Frank remained silent, his hands clenching the arms of his wheelchair. Rachel Chen approached him discreetly, showing him photos on her cell phone. A neighbor's security cameras, she explained quietly. 2 people entering the property an hour before the fire. One of them looks a lot like Marcus Thompson Jr. Alexandra watched the scene, her legal mind already formulating strategies. Arson could be exactly the mistake they'd been waiting for. The moment when Barbara Thompson and her accomplices finally went too far. Michael, she called out, I need you to contact all the auction buyers. Offer to buy back the cars for their real market value. If they refuse, mention that they will be investigated for receiving fraudulently obtained goods. What about Barbara? He asked, still furious. Alexandra smiled determinedly. Leave her to me. Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war. And Barbara Thompson just gave us all the weapons we needed. The sirens of the firefighters began to silence, leaving only the crackling sound of the last embers. The afternoon sun painted the sky red, as if nature itself were reflecting the violence of the day. But in the shadows of that disaster, the seeds of justice were beginning to sprout. A brown folder slid across the polished table in the meeting room of the Martinez & Associates law firm. Alexandra spread out its contents, revealing dozens of photographs, financial documents, and deposition transcripts. 5 days after the arson, the Williams case had turned into a much bigger investigation than a simple dispute with an HOA. The pattern is clear, Alexandra explained to Frank and Michael Williams, while pointing to a complex diagram on the wall. In the last 3 years, Oak Ridge Development Corp. has acquired 17 properties under suspicious circumstances, all preceded by astronomical increases in HOA fees or fabricated allegations of code violations. And all of these properties form a perfect corridor for the new luxury development, added Rachel Chen, who had joined the team as an investigative consultant. a $500 million project that would only be viable if they could acquire the Williams property. Frank, sitting in his wheelchair, studied an aerial photo of the neighborhood. So the cars were never the real problem. No, confirmed Alexandra. They were just a convenient excuse. Barbara needed a pretext to pressure you into selling. When she realized she couldn't, she opted for a more aggressive approach. Michael, who had spent the morning on the phone with buyers from the auction, had news of his own. 3 owners have already agreed to return the cars for a refund. But there's something strange. The others seem to be under some kind of pressure not to negotiate. A knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was James Morrison, a veteran detective from the Greenwich Police Department, carrying a briefcase of his own. "The fire analyses have arrived," he announced, his expression grave. "We found accelerant residue at multiple points of origin. This was definitely premeditated. And there's more. Traffic cameras picked up Marcus Thompson Jr.'s car leaving the area 15 minutes before the first alarm." Alexandra smiled discreetly. "Excellent. That gives us the probable cause we needed for the search warrants." "They're already being prepared," confirmed Morrison. "But you need to know, Barbara Thompson has powerful connections. The mayor just called to ask about the investigation." "Of course he did," muttered Rachel, making notes. Her husband was his biggest campaign donor. Frank adjusted his position in the chair, his voice laden with determination. "It doesn't matter who she knows. The truth needs to come out." Alexandra agreed, starting to organize the documents into specific piles. "It will. I've just received information about a secret HOA board meeting scheduled for tonight. Apparently Barbara is nervous, and nervous people make mistakes." The plan began to take shape quickly. Rachel would use her contacts to position a news crew near the meeting location. Detective Morrison would ensure that unmarked vehicles were strategically positioned. And Alexandra. Alexandra had her own role to play. At 8 p.m., Barbara Thompson's private office at the local country club was lit up. Through the windows, you could see bustling figures moving from side to side. Alexandra, wearing an elegant black suit, crossed the lobby with confidence, as if she belonged there. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is a private meeting." A security guard tried to stop her. Alexandra smiled, removing a document from her briefcase. "Actually, as the legal representative of an HOA member, I have a right guaranteed by statute to attend any board meeting. Section 12, paragraph 4 of your own bylaws." Inside the room, Barbara Thompson was in the middle of a speech when Alexandra entered. "We need to hold the line. If an owner manages to question our authority—" "Good evening," Alexandra interrupted. "I hope I'm not too late to discuss the legality of the council's latest actions." Barbara's face paled momentarily, but she pulled herself together. "This is a closed executive meeting." "Actually," Alexandra replied, handing out copies of documents to the members present. "Under Connecticut state law, all HOA meetings must be open to the membership, except in very specific circumstances. And conspiracy to commit real estate fraud is not one of them." A nervous buzz ran through the room. Richard Norton began to sweat visibly. "That's absurd," Barbara declared, but her voice trembled slightly. "Guards." "Oh, about that," smiled Alexandra. "The security guards are a bit busy talking to federal agents at the moment. Something about suspicious financial transactions and tax evasion." At that very moment, siren lights began to reflect through the windows. Detective Morrison entered the room, followed by other officers. "Barbara Thompson," he announced. "You are under arrest for arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several other crimes that I'm sure will come up during the investigation." While Barbara was being handcuffed, Alexandra noticed Richard Norton discreetly trying to delete something on his cell phone. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Norton," she warned. "Destruction of evidence is a federal crime." Outside, TV cameras captured the scene. Rachel Chen, surrounded by a news crew, narrated the events live. The story of the corrupt Oak Ridge Heights HOA was about to go national. Back at the Williams estate, Frank watched the coverage on television with Michael by his side. One of the auction buyers had just called, offering to return his Duesenberg for a fair price. "You know, son," said Frank, "when I started collecting these cars, I never imagined that they would become the catalyst for exposing so much corruption." "And it's not over yet," replied Michael. "Alexandra thinks this could lead to a broader investigation into abusive practices by HOAs across the state." Frank smiled, for the first time in days. Maybe something good can come out of all this after all. Outside, the stars shone down on the empty spaces where the garages used to be. But now, those spaces no longer represented loss. They were symbols of a battle for justice that had only just begun. The news of Barbara Thompson's arrest ran like wildfire through the Oak Ridge Heights community. The Greenwich Times splashed on its front page, "HOA president arrested, real estate fraud scheme exposed." But for Alexandra Martinez, that was just the tip of the iceberg. In her office, she was examining a disturbing new discovery, an external hard drive recovered from the country club dumpster on the night of the arrest. Richard Norton, in his moment of panic, had tried to get rid of it, a mistake that would prove fatal to the whole operation. "You need to see this," she told Frank and Michael Williams, who were arriving for their morning meeting. "We found records of bribes paid to city officials, fraudulent changes to zoning maps, and something even more interesting, a similar scheme being run in 3 other counties." Michael adjusted his glasses, studying the documents on the screen. "You mean Oak Ridge Heights wasn't an isolated case?" "Far from it," Alexandra replied. Oak Ridge Development Corp. was just one of a dozen front companies. Barbara built a real empire based on intimidation and real estate fraud. Detective Morrison entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. "We just searched the Thompsons' summer home on Martha's Vineyard. You won't believe what we found." He spread photographs on the table, dozens of them showing Barbara in meetings with local politicians, developers, and most surprisingly, with 2 cars from Frank's collection that had disappeared after the auction. "The Duesenberg and the Pierce Arrow," Frank whispered, instantly recognizing his beloved vehicles. "So that's where they were." "In her private garage," confirmed Morrison. Apparently, Barbara planned to sell them to a European collector for their real value, a few $1,000,000. The money would be used to bribe more officials for her real estate project. Rachel Chen, who had become an integral part of the investigative team, hurried into the office. "You need to see this," she said, connecting her laptop to the TV in the living room. "I've just received a video from an anonymous source." On the screen came a recording of a meeting that had taken place 6 months earlier. Barbara Thompson was talking openly about her plan with investors. "Oak Ridge Heights is just the beginning," she said in the video. "With the model we've developed, we can replicate this in wealthy communities throughout the Northeast. HOAs are the perfect tool. Virtually unlimited power with almost no oversight." Alexandra made a few quick notes. That explains why she was so desperate to remove the Williams. Their property wasn't just a local obstacle, it was a threat to her entire business model. "What about the other buyers at the auction?" asked Michael. "All connected in some way to the larger scheme," replied Morrison. "Businessmen who would receive contracts in the new developments, politicians who would approve the zoning changes, even a judge who would secure favorable rulings in property disputes." Frank watched it all in silence, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. "You know," he finally said, "I always wondered why Barbara seemed to have such a hatred of my collection. Now I understand. It wasn't hatred, it was envy. I had something she couldn't buy, a legitimate heritage, genuine respect from the community." Alexandra smiled. "And that's why we're going to use your story to bring down the whole scam. The press is already fascinated. The elderly collector who used classic cars to help the community versus the corrupt HOA president who tried to steal his legacy." Rachel nodded in agreement. "Audiences love a good David versus Goliath story, especially when Goliath ends up in handcuffs." Just then, Alexandra's phone rang. It was her contact at the federal prosecutor's office. After a brief conversation, she hung up with an even bigger smile. "Barbara is singing like a canary," she announced. Apparently, the prospect of decades in federal prison has changed her attitude. She's offering names, dates, bank accounts, everything. "What about the cars?" asked Frank, his voice betraying a hint of hope. "They'll all be returned," Morrison assured him. "The ones that were on Martha's Vineyard are already being transported back, and with Barbara cooperating, we'll be able to trace the others quickly." Michael put a hand on his father's shoulder. "We'll rebuild the garages, Dad. Better than before. And this time," Alexandra added, "we'll make sure your property has even stronger legal protections. I'm thinking of a non-profit foundation dedicated to historic automobile preservation and community education." Frank smiled, tears in the corners of his eyes. "You know, when all this started, I thought I was losing not only my cars, but all the meaning they had. Now I see that they had an even greater purpose." Rachel was already typing on her laptop. The full story comes out tomorrow. How a classic car collection exposed a criminal empire of HOAs. It's going to be an earthquake in the real estate market. Alexandra organized her documents, preparing for a series of meetings with federal prosecutors. Barbara Thompson wanted to use Oak Ridge Heights as a model for her fraudulent operations. Instead, it will serve as a model of how communities can unite against corruption. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Greenwich, casting a golden glow over the spaces where Frank's garages once stood. Soon those empty spaces would be filled again, not just with classic cars, but with the triumph of justice over greed. The hall of the Connecticut Federal Court was packed when Barbara Thompson entered, handcuffed and wearing her orange prison uniform. Her face, once marked by arrogance, now bore the weight of someone who has seen her empire crumble in a matter of weeks. Alexandra Martinez was organizing her documents at the prosecution table, occasionally exchanging confident glances with Frank and Michael Williams, sitting in the front row. After 2 months of intense investigation, the case had become the biggest anti-corruption operation in Connecticut history. "All rise," announced the bailiff. "Judge Margaret Sanderson presiding." The judge, a 60-year-old black woman known for her unwavering integrity, scanned the room before speaking. "This court is assembled for sentencing in the case of United States v. Thompson et al. Before we proceed, are there any statements the defendant would like to make?" Barbara stood up slowly, her handcuffs jingling in the silence of the courtroom. "Your Honor, Her voice faltered. For the first time, there was no manipulation in her eyes, only defeat. "I recognize the extent of my crimes, not just against the Williams, but against an entire community that trusted me." Alexandra watched intently as Barbara continued her confession. The last few weeks had revealed an even bigger scheme than they had initially imagined. 12 HOAs in 4 different states, more than 200 families affected, losses estimated at more than $100 million. "The record indicates," the judge continued, "that your cooperation was instrumental in dismantling a significant network of real estate corruption. However, the calculated nature of your crimes, especially the arson that could have resulted in deaths, cannot be ignored." Frank Williams shook his son's hand as the judge began to pronounce the sentence. 15 years in federal prison for Barbara, 10 years for her son Marcus. Confiscation of all illegally acquired assets. A complete victory, but one that came with a bittersweet taste. After court, on the steps of the building, Rachel Chen was conducting interviews for a special story. "Mr. Williams," she asked, "with today's verdict and the recovery of your collection, what do you plan to do now?" Frank smiled. Looking at the classic cars parked on the street, each one recovered and restored in recent weeks. "Let's turn this story of greed into something positive for the community." Alexandra approached, carrying a blue folder. "The Williams Foundation for Historic Preservation and Community Education documents were approved this morning," she announced. "The entire property is now protected as a heritage site." "And that's not all," Michael added. We already have 5 other communities interested in our model of transparent management of HOAs. People are tired of abuses of power. Detective Morrison, who was watching the scene from afar, approached with news. We've just arrested the last fugitive in the scheme, a developer in Rhode Island. The network has been completely dismantled. That afternoon, back at the Williams estate, a modest celebration was taking place in the rebuilt garages. Local residents, many of whom had been Barbara's victims, gathered to admire the classic cars and share their stories. "You know," said Frank, as he ran his hand over the gleaming hood of the Duesenberg, "when I started this collection, it was just about preserving automotive history. Now, I see it's about preserving something much bigger, the community spirit that Barbara tried to destroy." Alexandra watched as children took photos in the cars, their families sharing memories of past charity events. Barbara's real crime, she reflected, was not just against property, but against human connections. Rachel, who was finalizing her notes for the final article on the case, captured the moment when Frank handed over the keys to the Packard 12 to a young volunteer. "For the next generation of guardians," he said, smiling. The transformation of the Williams estate into a community center for historic preservation was just beginning. The garages now included a small museum, documenting not only the history of the cars, but also the battle against corruption that almost destroyed them. "Sometimes," Michael said to Alexandra, as they watched the sun set over the garages, "you have to lose something to understand its true value." "And sometimes," she replied, "you have to fight for what's right, even when it seems impossible." Frank, in his wheelchair, observed his property now full of life and renewed purpose. The cars, more than just machines, had become symbols of resistance against tyranny and corruption. "Barbara wanted to erase our history," he said to no one in particular, "but she ended up helping to strengthen it." The sound of a classic engine roaring in the distance echoed through the afternoon air, like music to the ears of everyone present. It was the Pierce Arrow, taking a group of children from the local hospital for a special ride, a tradition that was now guaranteed for generations to come. And so, as the shadows lengthened over Oak Ridge Heights, a new era began, an era of transparency, community, and mutual respect, built on the ashes of an empire of greed. Frank Williams' cars, more than survivors of a battle, had become guardians of a legacy far greater than their creator ever imagined. The fight against Barbara Thompson was over, but its true impact had only just begun. In communities across the country, people were beginning to question and challenge abuses of power, inspired by the story of a car collector who refused to be silenced. "This is just the beginning," Alexandra whispered, watching the families gathered around the historic cars. And she was right. The Williams legacy was destined to inspire change far beyond the boundaries of Greenwich, Connecticut.